Patrick McGee, let's start by just talking about how you went about this research, how you gathered the data.
One thing I would say is that I think often when you're talking to Apple people, the layperson thinks you're talking to disgruntled employees. Well, I didn't talk to 200 disgruntled employees, but I did speak to a lot of people who are unhappy with the consolidation into China over the last quarter century. So they'll have, the time of their life, their biggest career highlights at Apple, but they're not big fans of how Tim Cook, the CEO, has really just consolidated Apple into China to such an extent that they really are quite stuck there.
Just set out precisely the scale of Apple's investment in China and how it compares.
So Apple did an internal study in 2016 and determined that in the previous year, they had invested $55 billion into China. There's got to be some better UK equivalent that I could give you, but the US one I use is that Biden's flagship act called the CHIPS Act is about bringing chip fabrication back to America. That's $53 billion over 4 years. So you can think of this as a CHIPS Act every year, but in our greatest adversary's country.
And it exceeded the post-war Marshall Plan in scale.
Isn't that insane? I mean, it just sounds totally nuts. And not only does it exceed by basically a factor of 2 the Marshall Plan's impact on Europe, but that was for 16 countries. This is for 1. Apple is in one sector and one sector only, and it's advanced electronics. And that's been called by Barry Naughton, a China scholar and economist, the most important thing to Xi Jinping. So what makes Apple distinguished from basically everybody else is they don't rely on suppliers to come up with their own innovations, and then they'll say, oh, that's cutting edge, we'll use that. They go build those parts, and they'll even build the machinery and do the software for the machinery to come up with all those innovations.
So it's kind of mentoring,
supervising, auditing, and the very machines we're talking about cost billions of dollars in the aggregate, and Apple would foot the bill for all of that in the early years of moving into China. So they're not just making these suppliers work beyond their perceived capabilities, they're making them work beyond their actual capabilities. And once you understand how maniacal Apple is about the details and that they're building iPhones at about $250 million per year, you begin to realize that, oh, we are literally talking about a nation-building effort here.
So you talked about flying American engineers over there, over to China. They actually persuaded the airlines to lay on extra flights, didn't they?
Yes. So there's sort of 3 crazy stats here. So in 2014, Apple basically tells United Airlines, we need you to start flying to Chengdu, a place they called iPad City, 3 times a week. Because we will buy so many of the first-class seats that if the rest of the plane is empty, you'll still make money. And it becomes the longest non-stop flight that United has on the globe. 2 years later, they do the same thing to Hangzhou, which is sort of an industrial cluster outside of Shanghai. And in 2019, United accidentally leaked that Apple was their biggest corporate client, flying 50 people first class per day from San Francisco to Hong Kong.
And this came at a cost in some ways to the American families who were sort of split up by this commute, as it were.
Yeah, so many marriages are broken up in the first 5 years of Steve Jobs' comeback after 1997 that engineers begin referring to the DAP, the Divorce Avoidance Program, which is a series of measures, bonuses for spouses, time off for certain workers because their marriages are on the line. So it's like, where's Kathy this weekend? We need Kathy in the factory. And it's like, Kathy's marriage is so close to being over that that she can't come to work today, and she's not going to be here tomorrow, and you need to understand that. But eventually, we need Kathy in the factory. So the policy evolves a little bit. So your spouse would be getting $10,000 for every unexpected trip that Kathy takes to China.
I'm sure he'd consider that a bargain. So standing back, who's exploiting whom here? Is the US exploiting China, or is it the other way around?
So it's mutual exploitation. Tim Cook calls it mutually symbiotic, and I would be a little more cynical. So what Apple is getting out of the country, I think, is relatively clear. Really low wages, cutting-edge automation. I mean, there's all sorts of tailor-made policies, from tax-exempt bonded zones for your production. I mean, a whole host of things. China is brilliant at luring in foreign capital and making it a sort of multinational playground. And Apple is just a company that sort of exploits that best. But engendered in the way that Apple sets up its operations is technology transfer. And because Apple is so epic, the technology transfer is epic. And so, in the US, we're not building any advanced electronics, certainly not Apple, and yet we're doing all of it in China. And so the effect is that the shop floor innovation, the tacit knowledge, the experiential knowledge is all sort of taking place in China. And the proof is in the pudding that, 1 out of 2 smartphones in the world built today is the Chinese brands, whose suppliers are also damn good because Apple trained them all.
I mean, you compare Apple to Prometheus, giving China the gift of fire.
Yeah.
What are the consequences of that in terms of the economy, the world economy, but also security.
I mean, you could say in a positive light that Apple has contributed to the mass alleviation of poverty in China. I mean, that would be the great way to spin it. And in the early years of Apple being there, I think that would be a totally fine narrative. The problem is Xi Jinping takes China in a very different direction. He's another Putin in the making. And so once you're thinking about a dictator who's proclaiming that he will annex Taiwan in this generation, then you realize that by up-arming this country into a high-tech adversary, we're making that easier.
Right.
And so it's really disquieting.
Well, so how does all of this explain why Trump blinked first? You know, America's dependence on China, Apple's dependence on China. Is that why Trump blinked first in his tariffs war?
So an astounding claim, and I don't know what the counter-argument would be, that insofar as Apple is a bargaining chip between the two superpowers, it's Beijing's bargaining chip. 90% of Apple production is in China. I mean, effectively 0% is in America. So I think Trump had to blink because in a matter of days after so-called Liberation Day, Apple lost $800 billion worth of market value. If you are a typical investor that puts your money in an index fund, Apple is your #1 holding. So just for that purposes, that was an untenable situation for Donald Trump to find himself in.
But can, in time, America's reliance on China and Apple's reliance on China be unpicked, or is there absolutely zero chance of doing what Trump wants and, you know, producing all this stuff in America?
So the analogy I would use is the sort of Chinese version of chess, if you will, is Go. And in Go, you don't call checkmate. You don't go after the king. You encircle your enemy and you put them in a position where they're not able to make any good moves. That's the position Apple finds itself in.
Interesting. OK, so, I mean, if Trump can't afford to make an enemy of China, you know, how does he weaken their economy? How does he get what he wants out of China?
Trump famously said to Zelensky of Ukraine, you don't hold the cards. That's what I would be saying if I was Xi Jinping to Donald Trump. I mean,
I'd love to see that Oval Office meeting.
Yeah, that's one that's not going to be broadcast, is it? And Trump's, you know, too smart to do that.
But, I mean, what do you see happening after this 90-day pause? Because there has been this sort of rapprochement of sorts, but what happens next?
So before the 90-day pause, when you really did have high tariffs, not just on China, but on Vietnam and on India, I mean, you really had short-circuited Apple's plans to diversify to these other countries. The diversification, by the way, is really just assembly. It's not the depth and breadth of the supply chain. You really can't move that very quickly. But when that was the actual policy, and it only lasted a couple of days, I mean, I wrote in the New York Times, this is the biggest threat to Apple's operations since Steve Jobs returned to the company in 1997. If we somehow return to that after 90 days, Apple will lose $800 billion again. I mean, it's a completely untenable position for them to be in.
So there's no way out. But I mean, what happens if China goes to war with Taiwan or whatever, and, you know, Trump is still president? What does he do about that?
No company in the world is more exposed to China annexing Taiwan than Apple. Not only is basically all of the assembly and all of the manufacturing depth and breadth of production in China, 100% of all the important CPU chips come out of Taiwan. If there's a war, an annexation of Taiwan, none of those chips get made within the first hour of the war. It's all gone.
But of course, Apple says that the book is untrue. It's full of inaccuracies.
They said it before they'd read it, so I'll let you decide how credible that was.
Have they read it now?
I assume dozens of people at Apple have read it now, but they haven't updated their criticism, and I don't expect they ever will.
Patrick McGee, thank you very much.
Cheers, Kathy.